My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the co-founder of the Parent Venture. We are delighted to welcome today Dr. Eran Magen for how to support your upset child or teen. Welcome, Eran.
Hooray, thank you very much. Wow, virtual clapping, that's a first. Thank you, Nora and Mary and Sean. Okay, clearly peer pressure works. That's today's lesson. For those of you who are willing to turn on your cameras, I think that's nice for everybody to see more faces and just get a feel that this is a community, because it is, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of people here who care about parenting and maybe even care about each other's parenting. It's just nice to see people. So I'll talk for a little bit. I'll try not to talk for very long. Judy, hello, nice to see you. So I'll talk for a bit, and then after that, the goal is to have a discussion, really, questions that you have for everybody, really. I'll probably have some opinions and some thoughts, but it gets most interesting and I think most helpful when people start sharing information with one another. Because that's, again, the benefit of doing this in a community format. Okay, let me start. Ta-da, yes? Okay, so we'll talk about ideas for how to support your upset child or teen. My email is there at the bottom. We'll put it again in the chat at the end. You're welcome to give me, to send me an email about whatever questions or suggestions you have, or we can set a time to talk if you want. I'm happy to help, whoever needs. I'm not charging for this. This is a passion project, you might say. The URL at the bottom will also put in the chat later on. You can get all of the slides from here if you want to later on, if you're finding the slides helpful. So the first thing I wanted to say is just to remind you all that you are doing a very good job parenting. Parenting is tricky, challenging on all kinds of levels. And if you're even here to learn more about ways to parent, then good for you and good for your kids. Well done. I also want to say, right at the front, a couple of things. One is what I'm telling you here are my opinions and my views and my suggestions. I'm not claiming to have total ownership of truth. Oh, hello. Thank you, Sean. Oh, what happened? Hold on. I'm going to retake this. There we go. So I'm not claiming to have total ownership of truth. I think my opinions are based both on research and experience, but it's not going to be right for everybody all the time. So take what works for you, experiment, and if it doesn't, that's okay. And the other thing I wanted to say is just to be, again, really transparent about this. I don't do the stuff that I'm recommending 100% of the time, even when I want to, right? Because sometimes I forget, or sometimes I'm stressed and I do other things. So I don't want to be coming in pretending to be like walking on water and telling you all how to do your life. I'm not. I'm trying to, and this is the best I've figured out so far. That's what I'll be sharing with you. Okay. Having said all this, for context, in terms of what I'll be talking about today, I think about interactions as going from really low emotional intensity to high emotional intensity. Specifically, how much emotional intensity the person in front of us has. So if the intensity is pretty low, if the emotional charge is not great, that's a good time to be building relationships. There's a separate set of content on that we'll be presenting later in this series over the course of the year, how to build strong, collaborative, trusting relationships with your kids. When emotions are running a little higher is the time to be offering support and helping your child process whatever is happening and maybe solve what's happening. And if emotions are running very high to the point of danger to anyone, that's when it becomes crisis. And the rules really change in crisis, right? You prioritize safety and sacrifice the relationship, at least short term, if you need to. Whereas in green and yellow land, my general approach is to prioritize relationship over everything else, really, because what matters in the end is the relationship, and having a good relationship makes everything so much easier. So today we're here. Today, the assumption is that you're starting a conversation with your child, and your child kind of looks like this, kind of a bad day, and you're thinking, oh no, what happened? How can I help? So this is the starting point for the conversation. And for those of you that have limited time or limited attention span, I'm going to give you the very bottom line in the next 30 seconds, and the rest of me talking will be just elaborating on this bottom line. Okay, so here's the bottom line. When anyone has really a big emotional charge inside, they cannot process anything you have to say. There's no point in trying to add wisdom to them, getting them to change their perspective, giving them the solution. They can't process it. It's just going to spill out, or worse, you're going to end up fighting them. It's like your solution is fighting their emotional charge, right? The thing I recommend doing when you're dealing with somebody who has a high emotional charge, not crisis, but a high emotional charge, is to try to help them reduce the level of emotional intensity that they're experiencing. And below a certain line, and we'll talk later about when that line is reached, below a certain line, they can then take in your input and make good use of it. Apply your solutions, recognize your immense wisdom. But if they're still charged, there's no point. It's just going to start a fight. That's the bottom line here, right? So initially help them reduce the charge, later do everything else that you would normally do. Okay, that's the end of the bottom line. For those of you who are short on attention, you can attend away now. Otherwise, let's continue together. I want to step back for a minute and talk about things maybe at a broader perspective before we dive into the tactical. And what is it that causes suffering? I think for everybody, certainly for kids as well. And when I say suffering, I distinguish that from pain. So pain is that kind of first order experience, right? You stub your toe, for example, as you're walking around in your house, and that hurts. Suffering is when we insist that reality should be different from the way it is now. For example, I should not have stubbed my toe, or my toe should not be hurting right now. Right? That's when we get into the realm of suffering, because in resisting reality, it's a losing battle. Reality is going to win. Likewise, if we're sad and we tell ourselves, oh, we shouldn't be sad, at this point, we're fighting reality. If somebody's saying something to us we don't like, and we think, oh, that person shouldn't be talking to me that way, right? At that point, we're just resisting reality, and that resistance is the suffering, as I see it. Being able to accept reality as it is currently is the anti-should, right? Is the stop of resistance. And in those same three examples, if I stub my toe on a table and it hurts, I can say, wow, this really hurts. I need to take care of my toe now, right? As opposed to sit there blaming myself for having stubbed my toe and being stupid and being inattentive and things like that, right? So I move away from continuing to injure myself emotionally and move on to taking care of myself. If somebody is saying something that I don't like to me, then instead of spending time on, oh, that person shouldn't talk to me that way, that's not okay. They shouldn't be saying this, to say to myself at least, oh, but they are saying that, and I don't want them to say that in the future anymore, right? But I'm not spending so much time on reality right now should be different. So I want to be, I still don't feel very clearly articulate about this, but when I say acceptance, I don't mean to say this is fine and this can just go on forever and I don't mind and I'll just sit here and take it. What I'm saying is accepting the fact that this is happening right now, that I can't change, that it's already happened, right? What I can change is what happens moving forward. The most common form of should that we do to ourselves is telling ourselves that we should be feeling differently. Right? I should not be tired. I should have more energy. I should have more patience. I should be nicer. I should be more assertive. I should be more agreeable. I should be, and all of those things. And it's a way of self-flagellating that is just really common. A lot of people do this. We all do this. And learning to say, well, this is how I am right now. Today I'm tired, or I'm short-tempered right now. Like, let me see what I can do about it, as opposed to saying it's not okay that I'm that way. With your kids, just with our kids, just like with us, it's the same kind of thing. The thing that causes the most distress is when we tell ourselves, I should be different, or the world should be different right now, or ideally 2 minutes ago. And when our child says this to him or herself, they're going through the same kind of suffering. And we can help them accept current reality while making plans for improving reality later. By offering them our acceptance, we can model acceptance. If we're able to accept their experience, if they're sad, if we're able to somehow demonstrate to them that we see their sadness, we respect their sadness, that it's okay for them to be sad, it's a really different message than don't be sad. Let's cheer you up right now. That thing shouldn't make you sad. Think about it differently, right? That's all that is jumping the gun and actually communicating that what they're feeling is not okay, as opposed to giving them a chance to feel it, process it, be done with it, move on to feeling better, presumably. So if we can accept them, they can learn to accept themselves through that. It's a kind of modeling, but acceptance is really hard sometimes. And here are a couple of reasons that accepting your child's emotions might be hard. One is, if, speaking to my son, I might say, when you make mistakes, I pay the price, right? If you're really upset, I have to stop everything and attend to you. If you play with things and then they break, I need to get new things or to fix them, and so on. There's just a potential real cost to mistakes that the other person is doing. Another one is, I might feel like I can solve this really easily. You're upset that your marbles aren't going down the right chute. You're upset that your grades are too low. You're upset that this other person that you're often unkind to doesn't want to hang out with you. I have solutions for all of these things, right? And so let me just offer them to you. I don't want to sit here and watch you be upset when I can just solve it really quickly and move on to the next thing. Of course, that's a mirage, right? Because I can give you all the solutions, but if you're upset, you can't actually hear them. You need to be less upset before you hear them. So that's a very common pitfall. But this is another reason why it's hard to accept, because I feel like I have a solution. And the other, and maybe the deepest, is when we see people that we love very much hurting, it hurts. It hurts us. It's painful to see somebody that we love in pain. And so we want to solve that quickly. We want to change it. We want to have them not feel pain so that we too can stop feeling pain. It's uncomfortable. And so there's this push to take shortcuts, to solve their issue, to solve their emotions as quickly as possible. And that shortcut is rarely a good idea. Okay, all this was on the more maybe strategic or philosophical level. So getting down into the tactical. When we're having a conversation with our child and we can tell our child is upset, we say, okay, I'm entering supportive mode. What does this mean? It means that we're going to have an interaction now, and in this interaction, there will be essentially 3 parts, roughly linear, but not necessarily. One is some sort of setup where I need to be clear with myself that I'm here and present, and I need to communicate this to my child, that I'm here and present. There's going to be a following phase and a leading phase. So the goal in setup is to be and to communicate, I am present. The goal in the following phase is to allow my child to release charge. My child essentially dictates where the conversation is going and what needs to be attended to, because my child will talk about the thing that is upsetting. And that's how people release charge. The goal when they're done releasing charge, we can move on to everybody's favorite stage, which is leading, which is where we can start asking questions, give advice, share stories, and all of that. I would suggest that in the leading phase, the goal is to equate power. So that rather than me giving you solutions as though I know everything about your life and everything about your social circumstances and everything about your body and everything, instead, my goal is to get to a point where it feels like we're a team working together, and you can tell me when the solutions that I'm suggesting are totally off base, so that we can continue working on it together. And I'm not offended, and you're not worried about this. We're talking together. We are team you solving this problem, right? As opposed to my solution against your problem. There's a whole set of sub skills, and we're not going to go over all of them. I'm not going to go over all of them today anyway. Especially the ones in the setup phase, I think you're already familiar with, right? Keeping in mind that the goal is to actually be present and to communicate the fact that you're present. These are basic things. Just put away distractions, ideally demonstrably, right? When your kid is coming in and you're like, how's it going? And your kid says, oh, terrible. You might say, hold on, I'm just going to finish this text message and then I want to hear what you have to say. And then you do this thing and then you go boop and you put it away. That's an important message to send. So make sure that you're present, that you're able to be present. If you're not able to be present, schedule the conversation for another time if you can. The following skills is most of what I'll focus on today. And in particular, in those following skills, I'm going to focus on this first one, on wigging. So WIG is an acronym for what I got. It's a word I made up because paraphrasing is a lot to say every time, but it's paraphrasing. It's the exact same thing. And it's, of course, the oldest trick in the therapist's book, but I don't think it's a trick at all. So I think the idea is that when somebody's talking with you, when your child is talking with you and is upset, the way that your child releases charge is by talking about the thing that's upsetting. Ideally, we engage with our child in a way that gets our child continuing to talk and processing whatever they want to talk and process, talk about and process, not what we think they need to talk about and process. And a very good way of doing it is to repeat what they're saying in our own words, with the question behind it being, am I understanding your experience correctly? And it's a real question. They tell us whether we got it or not. And they'll add detail or change what we're saying until they get a sense that we get it. And it's through this action that we communicate our acceptance of their experience. Remember, I was talking before a lot about the importance of acceptance. So if my child says, this happened, I don't know, maybe 8 months ago with my son is almost 5. And I think about 6 or 8 months ago, I was picking him up from preschool and he really wanted to open the door on the way out. As I finished picking him up and another kid ran past him and opened the door. And my son was furious because he wanted to open the doors, right? And he needed to talk about it for like 10 minutes. For me to be able to take it seriously is a big deal for him to say, I wanted to open the doors. And then I can say, oh, you wanted to do it? And he said, yeah. And then this other kid came and he didn't hear my words, which I guess is an expression that his teachers use in preschool. He wasn't listening to my words. And I said, oh, so you wanted to do it, but the other kid did it even though you told him not to. And he says, yeah. We kind of had this conversation in circles for about 10 minutes. And then he stopped, he literally stopped and he said, why am I feeling better like that? So, of course, he lives with me a lot. And so maybe that's part of it, but it's nice to have, and again, with young kids, you have much more visibility into their thought process because they tell you everything. But this happens with much older kids as well, and with grownups too, and in therapy as well, right? Where you can communicate your acceptance and your respect of the other person by checking if you're understanding your experience. And this happens by saying back what you heard. And if there's charge there, they'll keep talking. And if there's not, they'll get annoyed, right? So you don't do this when there's no charge. If your kid says, where are the keys? And you go, oh, so you want to know where the keys are. That's extremely annoying. Don't do that, right? But if they're upset about something, then it's really helpful. So some examples. Oh, you know what? Before the examples, like a conceptual tool, if you would. So one is this idea of the spotlight. So think of the spotlight as the topic of conversation, the subject of each sentence, right? So if your kid is upset, your kid is going to place the spotlight as close as comfortable to the thing that your kid is upset about. Your kid may not place it directly in the upsetting thing because maybe they're not sure they can talk about it with you yet. Or maybe they're not totally aware about what is the thing that is really upsetting for them in this story, right? But they'll place it as close as they can, or as close as comfortable to this thing that's upsetting to them. And when we wig well, we're not moving the spotlight at all. We're continuing to shine it at exactly the same place, and only our kid controls where the spotlight is going. And it'll probably move increasingly closer to the center of the thing that is upsetting for your kid. So spotlight is one way to think about it. And another is thinking about it in terms of driving, which I know is a terrifying thought when we combine it with the concept of our kids. But when your kid is upset and inviting you to talk about whatever is upsetting, it's as though your kid is driving and you're riding along. You're in the passenger seat in that following stage of the conversation. You're in the passenger seat. You never reach for the wheel and say, actually, let's turn right and see what's over there. You don't do that. Nor do you lean over and press on the gas pedal to get the conversation to move faster, right? They're driving, they're controlling everything. When they're not upset, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. When we switch to the leading phases, when you say, can we trade seats, basically, can I drive, right? But the following phase means they're in the driver's seat. They're controlling it. Okay, so a wig would be saying back what I got, saying it warmly and with care and acceptance, no judgment there, and keeping the spotlight squarely where it was before, right? And it's basically not anything else. It's a very, very simple thing to do. And it allows you to just have all of your attention on your kid. You don't need to be figuring out or thinking about solutions or analyzing what they're saying. You just listen. The idea is that every time that you get a wig right, like ideally they say something like, yeah, exactly. And when they do that, and when they feel your acceptance and know that you're understanding them, their charge goes down by 1 point. And you want to repeat this process as many times as you can, as long as they have charge to talk about, right? So they go, oh, I went to school and this kid was mean to me. And you say it back and they go, yeah, exactly. And then after he was mean to me, I thought maybe everybody hates me. Maybe I'm just a loser. And you go, oh, so you're feeling like you might be just a loser in general? He goes, yeah, exactly. Because, there've been a few kids that have been mean to me. But so every time you repeat this thing, and as they see that you're following, that you're understanding what they're saying, they keep talking. Eventually they run out of charge. Anywhere from, 2 to 10 minutes. That's the general trajectory there. So here's some examples. Your kid might be saying in the middle of a conversation, I have no idea what's going on in math, and I was sort of getting it until a month ago, and then we start getting into integrals or something, and I just have no idea what's going on. I hate math anyway. So here's some things that you might say. We used to do this as a survey, but in the interest of time, I'm going to run through it myself. So you might say, I really don't blame you. I hate math too, which may seem like a nice thing to say, right? And you're kind of siding with your kid, but there are a couple of problems with it. One is you're essentially shifting the spotlight to yourself, right? Especially if you go into speeches about how much you hate math. But another problem is that, again, you don't actually know what is the problem that your kid is trying to get to. Where is the conversation going? You don't really know. And if you're shutting it down at this point, you say, oh, you're right, math is stupid. Your kid is kind of stuck, like it's hard to continue because we don't know. Maybe your kid is talking about this because they feel generally behind in school and they're worried about their career, and we just don't know, right? And we won't know if we stop it quickly. So that's problematic. You might say, have you talked about it with the instructor? Which is great advice. But if your kid is upset, you're likely going to start playing the yes, but game, right? Your kid will be like, oh, the instructor is stupid too, and he's never helpful, and I tried, and da, 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 da. Whereas you might get a totally different reaction if you're suggesting this later when your kid is a little bit calmer, after you help your kid release the charge, right? So this is an example of charging in a little too soon with advice. Right, so good idea. Just let's save it for later. You might say, so math was making sense to you until he got into integrals, which I think is a fair wig, right? You're kind of saying, so am I understanding what you're saying? It was making sense, and then integrals kind of took you off course. To which your kid might say something like, it really hasn't been making a lot of sense for a while now, I guess. It wasn't exactly just the integrals. It was, maybe even when we started, blah, blah, blah. Because hearing it back from somebody makes you think about it for a second, right? So I like that one as a wig. Or you might say, oh, you're a smart kid. I'm sure you can figure it out. Like, you're fine. It's not a big deal. Which is encouraging on the face of it, but it's kind of minimizing your kid's problem, right? And your kid might say, oh, this shouldn't be a problem, right? I'm supposed to be smarter than that. Dad thinks I'm smarter than that, so now what does that mean about me, right? And again, this is something that you might say later when your kid is a little calmer, but I would start with acceptance, paraphrasing. I'm not even sure I would want to say this exactly this way later on, because there's a risk there in terms of the message that we're sending the kid, that it's not okay to feel challenged in this way. We can talk about this more later. Okay, here's another example, the last one for today. So your kid might say something like, I think I took on too many commitments and I thought it would be fun and interesting, but now I just feel totally stretched and nothing's fun anymore. These things just feel bad. So we're trying to wig this. Actually, I'm going to take like a silent moment, see if you can formulate a wig in your mind, right? How would you respond when your kid says this? If you're feeling extra brave, you could put it in the chat too. So here are some examples of possible responses. One is we might say, yeah, knowing you probably took on way too much, haha. Which could be funny, and maybe that's the way that you and your kid relate to each other, but I think it's kind of an unnecessary gamble in terms of whether or not this would work, right? And I would caution away from anything ironic when the other person is upset, because there's subtle judgment there, and if the person is in a sensitive spot, that's not what they might be picking up when you say something like that. Okay, so you might say, can you figure out which commitments aren't as important, then just drop them and reprioritize? Great advice. They may not be ready to hear it, right? If they're upset, the world is confusing and threatening. They'd be like, well, everything is super important. I have to have 10 things on my CV in order to do important teenage things. And so, and you might get a very different reaction when they're calmer, right? So again, good advice, but later, not while they're actively upset. You might say, you're probably just a little tired, get some rest and you'll feel a lot better. Which, by the way, is 100% true for me. Basically, every time I'm upset, I realize that I'm tired, but I realize it after the fact, typically. So this may be sound advice, but again, not something I would do when somebody's actively upset, looking for someone to hear them and understand them, right? Because in the moment, it feels minimizing. It feels like, your problem is not really a problem. And that's not a fun message to be getting when we're upset. So you might say something like, so your commitments are getting to be a lot now, which is, much shorter than what your kid gave you, but really is the essence, in my mind, of what the kid is trying to say here, right? So you say something like this, so your commitments are getting to be a lot now, and your kid might say, a lot? My commitment, everything is getting to be a lot now. There's so much schoolwork, there's so much extracurricular stuff. I just feel like I'm supposed to be doing all the, great. They're talking, right? You're learning important things, they're releasing charge, you're connecting, wonderful. All right, so the goal is to have this conversation where as you talk, as they talk, you wig, they feel more and more heard. As they feel more heard and more accepted, their charge goes down. Maybe they're starting to process whatever it is that they're going through. And eventually, at some point, you give your final wig and they say something like, yeah, and they just look at you and they stop talking, which means that maybe they're out of big charge. So I would say count to 6, give them a lot of time. They might be thinking, they might be trying to figure something out, but count to 5, count to 6. And if they said nothing, then you can check if they're really out of charge. So the way to do it is to summarize. So a summary is just like a wig, but it's bigger. It's a big wig. It's like a 2-3 sentence wig covering the arc of the story. So you go wig, 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 and your kid goes, yeah, exactly. And you count to 6 and your kid still hasn't said anything. And so you might say something like, okay, so let me see if I'm getting this, like the whole story, okay? You're saying when you got into middle school, you made a lot of friends, super fun, school was easy, everything was awesome, but, and most of the first year felt like that, right? But hitting 7th grade now, it feels like there's too much schoolwork. It's really stressful. The extracurricular stuff is getting to be less fun because it kind of pulls you away from schoolwork that feels really important to be doing well. But all your friends are like doing all these extracurricular things and seem like they're having such a good time, and you're feeling like you're kind of behind, or less able to handle everything. That would be potentially, that's an example of a summary of like what might have been a 5-minute conversation before, right? And so after you say all this, essentially one of two things will happen. Either your kid goes, yeah, I feel definitely less capable than everybody, and I feel like they know that I'm less capable, and they charges up, they talk more. You know what to do when charges up and they talk, you listen. Great. This is great. The more they talk, the more helpful I'm being, really. People benefit from talking, not from hearing our solutions, by and large. And so if they're talking more, great. And actually, if they're talking more after a summary like this, then congratulations, you've hit level 2. Typically, they'll talk about something more significant, more meaningful, closer to the core for them at that point. So you listen and you wig, and eventually they get back down and you summarize again with this new information. And the other option is, rather than kind of heating up, they might say, yeah, you got it. That's exactly right. And they still don't talk. At which point, the following stage is over. Congratulations. And you can switch to everybody's favorite part, which is the leading part. You're building up a lot of trust and a lot of relational credit with your kid when you're following well, when you're listening well and following well. And when you're leading is your big chance to just destroy everything you've built up to that point by shoving unwelcome advice down their throat. And so this is why I think it's so important to use this time to equate power. And there are a couple of things that you can do, really simple, really fast things that you can do to make sure that the interaction feels more equal. So one of them is, before you switch into leading, just ask for permission. Literally ask for permission. So you can say, can I make a suggestion? Or you might say, do you want to hear what I think? Or you might say, this reminds me of a story. Do you want to hear it? Or can I ask some questions? Or whatever it is, right? But ask for advice. Ask for permission. And it takes 4 seconds. Your kid will likely say yes. And if your kid says no, then don't. And say, okay, thank you for sharing all this with me. And if you want to talk about it more, I'll be there, right? But 92% of the time, they'll say, yeah, sure. And then before you proceed to give advice, or I guess wrapped around your advice, I would suggest that you be very clear about the fact that you don't know everything and that this is an opinion, right? So you might say something like, so I realize that, I mean, obviously I'm not in school with you and I don't know what your interactions with your friends at school looks like, but from what you've told me, blah, 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 blah. It sounds like my sense is that it would be a really good idea to blah, 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 or I think it could be helpful to blah, 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 blah. And then just ask them to disagree, right? Do you think, so I would suggest that you know, based on what you told me, my sense is that it could be really helpful to just take one of the kids aside. You know, you're telling me about Brian, and it seems like, you know, Brian has a tough time with the fact that you came in and just immediately took over all these positions and and maybe it would be easier to just spend some private time with Brian, just get to know each other and you know, maybe reduce the tension that way. What do you think? Do you think that could work? Is that realistic? Right? This is me seeing if my child disagrees. And when I do all this, all these moves make it really easy for the other person to say, that's not exactly right. You know, I don't think that makes sense. And because blah, 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 right? And they can share more detail and they can help me be a better helper for them, right? Whereas if I don't do all of these things, and if I'm not trying to be, if I'm not inviting them to critique my suggestion, right? The power differential may be such that they don't feel comfortable doing it, right? At which point they might either slam the door, literally or figuratively, right? They might say, that's a stupid idea, and they get upset and they walk away. Or they might say, yeah, sure, yeah, and not really mean it, in which case, still, I haven't really helped, right? I'd much rather they tell me no, and here's why I think your solution doesn't work. Then we can talk about it as a team, right? Trying to solve their problem together. All right, so this is what we covered today. We're rapidly approaching the end. When you're talking with somebody, say your child, who seems upset, and you're thinking about, exciting, it's a fire siren, I think. Sorry about that. When you're talking with your child and the child is upset and you kind of flip the supportive listening switch in your brain, think about setting up, making sure that you're present, showing that you're present, and then spend majority of your time and energy following. When you're following your kid in the story is when your kid is healing from the story, because you are accepting your kid's experience and showing your kid how to accept his or her own experience, right? And so you demonstrate this acceptance by saying back their experience and checking if you're understanding correctly. And as you go through this, your kid gains clarity, your kid feels appreciated and heard and cared for and connected. When your kid is done, you summarize. If your kid confirms that you got it right, if you want, and if you feel inspired, and if you have something useful to say, you can switch into leading, asking for permission first. You don't have to. I would say at least 80% of the benefit is in the following stage. It's amazing how good it feels and how helpful it is to have somebody just listen to us well without contributing content. But if you feel inclined to, then leading is perfectly fine. I would just suggest do it respectfully, right? Be mindful of the power differential and equating it as much as possible.